Welcome to the Sleeper Historian. Tonight we journey into a story whispered through time, a tale of mist, moonlight, and memory. This is the story of Washington Irving and the legend he left behind. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the gathering twilight of post-revolutionary America, when the cobblestones of Manhattan still echoed with the footsteps of a nation finding its voice, a child was born who would one day weave dreams into legend. The year was 1783, and the city of New York breathed with the uncertain rhythm of independence newly won. Streets that had known British boots now welcomed American souls, and in this atmosphere of transformation, Washington Irving drew his first breath. Picture, if you will, the narrow lanes of lower Manhattan, where wooden houses leaned against each other like old friends sharing secrets in the lamplight. The Irving family home stood among these dwellings, modest yet warm, filled with the gentle chaos of 11 children. William Irving Sr., a Scottish merchant with a stern countenance but tender heart, had named his youngest son after the great general who had led them to freedom. Little did he know that this child would carry a different kind of revolution in his mind, not of muskets and cannons, but of words and wonder. Young Washington was a dreamer from his earliest days, blessed with that peculiar gift of seeing magic in the mundane. While his older brothers bent over ledgers and learned the mathematics of commerce, Washington would steal away to the wharves, where tall ships from distant lands brought not just cargo, but stories. He would sit among the rope coils and barrels, listening to sailors speak of fog-shrouded coastlines and ancient castles, of legends that danced on the edge of memory like shadows on water. The boy's imagination was fed by more than maritime tales. His mother, Elizabeth, possessed that rare quality of understanding, a child's need for wonder. She would gather her youngest around the parlor fire during the long winter evenings, her voice soft as falling snow, and tell him stories of their Scottish heritage, tales of kelpies that swam in moonlit lochs, of spirits that wandered the moors, and of ancient kings whose deeds had passed into legend. These stories settled into Washington's soul like seeds in fertile ground, waiting for the right season to bloom. The city itself was his greatest teacher. New York in the 1790s was a place caught between worlds, no longer the new Amsterdam of Dutch memory, not yet the metropolis it would become. Old Dutch architecture stood beside newer federal buildings, creating a landscape where past and present walked hand in hand. Young Irving would wander these streets, his keen eyes noting how the old Dutch names still clung to lanes and landmarks like morning mist to the Hudson River. He heard the echo of different languages in the markets, saw how immigrants from many lands had woven their stories into the fabric of this new nation. School, however, proved less enchanting than the world beyond its walls. Washington was a reluctant scholar, finding more education in the pages of adventure novels than in his Latin primers. His teachers despaired of his wandering attention, not understanding that his mind was already composing the stories that would one day captivate a nation. He devoured the works of Shakespeare and Milton, but it was the ghost stories and folklore that truly captured his imagination. Even then, he seemed to understand that America needed its own mythology, its own collection of tales to rival the ancient legends of Europe. The yellow fever epidemic of 1798 brought a shadow across the Irving household, as it did to many families in the crowded city. The spectre of disease drove those who could afford it to seek refuge in the countryside, and young Washington found himself, for the first time, breathing the cleaner air of rural New York. Here, among the rolling hills and ancient forests that stretched north along the Hudson, he encountered a landscape that seemed to whisper of older times. The Dutch settlers had been here for generations, and their stories had taken root in this soil like the gnarled apple trees in their orchards. It was during these country sojourns that Washington first heard whispers of places like Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown, where time seemed to move differently, where the veil between the everyday world and the realm of spirits grew thin. Local farmers would speak, in hushed tones and with knowing glances, of strange sounds in the night, the thundering of hooves where no horse should be, the sight of a rider who cast no shadow beneath the moon. These tales were shared not as entertainment, but as warnings, passed down through generations of Dutch families who had learned to respect the mysteries of their adopted homeland. The boy listened with the intensity of one who recognized truth in the heart of legend. He understood, even then, that these stories were more than mere superstition. They were the way a people made sense of a world that often defied understanding. In the candlelit kitchens where these tales were told, Washington felt the stirrings of his calling. He would become not just a teller of stories, but a keeper of the American spirit, preserving in words the magic that dwelt in the spaces between fact and fancy. As the 18th century drew to its close, young Washington Irving stood on the threshold of manhood, his imagination already rich with the seeds of legend. The city of his birth had taught him to observe, to listen, to find wonder in the collision of old world and new. The countryside had shown him that America possessed its own brand of mystery, different from, but no less potent than the ancient folklore of Europe. And in his heart, a writer was awakening, one who would learn to capture in prose the elusive quality of moonlight on water, the whisper of wind through autumn leaves, and the eternal human hunger for stories that explain the unexplainable. The stage was set, the dreamer prepared. Soon the wider world would call to him, offering new experiences that would shape his craft and deepen his understanding of the stories that connect all human hearts. But in these early years, in the narrow streets of Manhattan and the misty valleys of the Hudson, the foundation was being laid for a legend that would outlive its creator, echoing through the centuries like the sound of phantom hoofbeats on a moonless night. The dawn of the 19th century found America stretching its young limbs, eager to prove itself not merely as a political experiment, but as a civilization capable of producing art, literature, and culture to rival the established nations of Europe. It was into this atmosphere of cultural awakening that Washington Irving stepped as a young man, carrying within him the stories he had gathered like a collector of rare butterflies, delicate and beautiful, waiting for the right moment to display their wings. The literary landscape of America in 1800 was sparse indeed. While Europe boasted centuries of accumulated literature, from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to the Gothic novels that were then thrilling readers in London drawing rooms, America had produced little more than political treatises and religious sermons. The very idea that this young nation might generate stories worth telling seemed almost presumptuous to many. How could a land with no ancient castles produce ghost stories? How could a country without kings and queens create fairy tales? Irving sensed the opportunity that lay hidden in this apparent disadvantage. America might lack the accumulated legends of the old world, but it possessed something perhaps more precious: the freedom to create its own mythology. In the coffeehouses and literary salons of New York, where young intellectuals gathered to debate the future of American letters, Irving listened and learned. He heard the longing in their voices, the desire to prove that Americans could be more than mere inheritors of European culture, that they could be creators in their own right. His first tentative steps into the literary world came through contributions to periodicals, those ephemeral publications that bloomed and withered like wildflowers in the bustling marketplace of ideas. Under various pseudonyms, he began to explore his voice, testing different styles and subjects like a painter mixing colors on his palette. These early pieces showed flashes of the wit and whimsy that would later make him famous, but they also revealed something deeper: a young writer grappling with the question of what it meant to be American, and how that identity might be expressed in literature. The inspiration for his breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While browsing in a bookstore, Irving discovered the works of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, particularly their creation of the character Sir Roger de Coverley in The Spectator. Here was a model for the kind of gentle, humorous character study that might translate beautifully to the American scene. But Irving understood that simply transplanting European literary forms to American soil would not suffice. The new literature would need to grow organically from American experience, drawing its strength from native roots. In 1807, working in collaboration with his brother William and their friend James Kirk Paulding, Irving published Salmagundi, a periodical that would prove to be his first significant literary success. The name itself, meaning a mixture or medley, perfectly captured the spirit of the enterprise. Here was literature that was distinctly American, satirical but not bitter, observant but not cynical, learned but not pompous. The writers adopted whimsical pseudonyms and created recurring characters who commented on New York society with the kind of gentle mockery that made even their targets laugh. But it was Irving's solo project that truly announced the arrival of a major American literary voice. A History of New York from the Beginning of the World to the End of the Dutch Dynasty appeared in 1809, published under the name Diedrich Knickerbocker. The work was ostensibly a serious historical study, but readers soon discovered that Irving had created something entirely new, a mock-heroic history that was both hilarious parody and affectionate tribute to New York's Dutch heritage. The genius of the Knickerbocker history lay not just in its humor, but in Irving's understanding that America needed to claim its past, even its relatively brief past, as material for literature. He took the Dutch burghers of New Amsterdam, a people who might have seemed too prosaic, too recent, too familiar for literary treatment, and transformed them into characters worthy of epic poetry. Governor Peter Stuyvesant became a figure as commanding as any European monarch, and the petty disputes of colonial life gained the dignity of classical drama. More importantly, Irving demonstrated that American writers need not apologize for their subject matter. The rolling hills of the Hudson Valley were as worthy of literary attention as the Scottish Highlands. The legends growing up around places like Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown possessed their own unique magic, different from, but equal to the ancient folklore of Europe. In creating Diedrich Knickerbocker, Irving had invented more than a character. He'd created a persona that could serve as a bridge between the old world and the new, someone who understood both traditions and could help forge a distinctly American voice. The success of the Knickerbocker history established Irving as the first American writer to achieve international recognition purely on literary merit. European critics, who had been inclined to dismiss American literature as a contradiction in terms, found themselves charmed by Irving's wit and impressed by his craftsmanship. Here was proof that the New World could produce writers worthy of attention, that American literature might be more than a curious provincial phenomenon. But success brought its own challenges. Irving found himself in the curious position of being America's first professional author, trying to make a living by his pen in a country that had no established tradition of supporting writers. The economics of literature in early 19th century America were harsh indeed. There were no international copyright protections, meaning that European works could be reprinted freely while American authors struggled to find publishers willing to pay for original content. The reading public, while growing, was still relatively small, and the infrastructure for distributing books across the vast American continent remained primitive. These practical considerations weighed heavily on Irving's mind as he contemplated his future. He had tasted the satisfaction of literary success, had felt the thrill of seeing his words reach readers and spark their imaginations. But could he build a career, a life, on such uncertain foundations? The question would soon become academic, as circumstances would conspire to send him across the Atlantic, where he would encounter the European literary tradition firsthand and discover influences that would shape his most enduring work. As the first decade of the 19th century drew to a close, Washington Irving stood at a crossroads. Behind him lay the modest but genuine success of his early works, the proof that American literature was not merely a dream, but a growing reality. Ahead lay uncertainty, adventure, and the experiences that would ultimately lead him to create the story that would make him immortal in the hearts of readers. The tale of a lanky schoolmaster, a headless horseman, and a sleepy Dutch settlement, where legends walked the earth with the confidence of old inhabitants welcoming newcomers to their ancient home. The nation was awakening to its cultural possibilities, and Irving had helped sound the reveille. Soon he would add to that, awakening the most haunting and enduring notes, stories that would prove that America, young as it was, could produce legends as powerful and mysterious as any that haunted the foggy moors of Scotland or the ancient forests of Germany. The dreamer was becoming a master of his craft, and the world was waiting to be enchanted. The year 1815 found Washington Irving aboard a packet ship cutting through the grey waters of the Atlantic, bound for Liverpool and the wider world beyond. He travelled not as a tourist seeking mere diversion, but as a young man caught between necessity and opportunity. The family business was foundering, requiring his attention to European affairs. Yet his heart yearned for the literary riches that awaited him in the Old World. As the American coastline faded into memory behind him, Irving carried with him the stories he had already begun to tell. But he was destined to return with treasures that would transform not only his own writing, but the very landscape of American literature. Liverpool greeted him with all the sooty grandeur of industrial England. The harbour bristled with the masts of ships from every corner of the empire, and the air thrummed with the sound of commerce conducted in a dozen languages. But it was not the mercantile bustle that captured Irving's imagination. It was the weight of history that seemed to press down from every stone building, every narrow street, every ancient church spire that had witnessed centuries pass like seasons. Here was a land where the past was not something to be read about in books, but something that lived and breathed in the very architecture. His business affairs in Liverpool proved as tedious as he had feared, involving long hours poring over ledgers and correspondence, wrestling with the complexities of international trade that had grown increasingly difficult in the aftermath of the War of 1812. But even these mundane responsibilities served his literary development, for they introduced him to a broader world of human experience. In the counting houses and warehouses, he encountered characters who seemed drawn from the pages of Dickens, though Dickens was still a child then. Men and women whose lives had been shaped by forces larger than themselves, who carried stories of triumph and tragedy with equal grace. When business allowed, Irving escaped into the broader landscape of England, and it was there that his education as a storyteller truly began. He made pilgrimages to places he had known only through literature. Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare's ghost seemed to linger in every shadow. The Lake District, where Wordsworth and Coleridge had discovered poetry in the play of light on water. And countless villages and market towns, where life continued much as it had for centuries, bound by traditions that stretched back into the mists of time. But it was not just the famous places that educated him. Irving possessed the writer's gift of finding significance in the overlooked and ordinary. In roadside inns, he listened to stories told by traveling merchants and farmers, tales that had been passed down through generations, polished smooth by countless retellings. He began to understand how folklore lived and breathed, how it adapted to changing times while preserving essential truths about human nature. These were not museum pieces, but living stories that continued to shape how people understood their world. The revelation came gradually, but it was profound. Irving began to see that America's literary disadvantage, its lack of ancient traditions, was also its greatest opportunity. European folklore was magnificent, but it was also fixed, crystallized by centuries of retelling into forms that could not easily be changed. American stories, by contrast, were still forming, still malleable, still capable of being shaped by a skilled hand. The challenge was not to imitate European models, but to understand their underlying principles and apply them to the raw material of American experience. His travels took him beyond England into the heart of continental Europe. In Germany, he encountered the brothers Grimm, who were then collecting the folk tales that would make them famous. Their systematic approach to folklore impressed him deeply. They understood that stories were not mere entertainment, but repositories of cultural wisdom, ways of preserving and transmitting the essential knowledge that societies needed to survive. Irving spent long evenings in German taverns, listening to stories that seemed to emerge from the very landscape. Tales of mysterious forests, enchanted castles, and supernatural encounters that blurred the line between the possible and the impossible. The German influence would prove particularly significant for Irving's development. German Romanticism, with its emphasis on emotion over reason, on mystery over clarity, on the individual's relationship with nature and the supernatural, spoke to something deep in Irving's artistic soul. He began to see how stories could serve purposes beyond mere entertainment. They could explore the psychological landscape of human experience, could give form to fears and longings that defied rational expression. In the ancient cities of the Rhine Valley, Irving walked streets that had been old when America was still an unknown wilderness. He visited castles perched on cliff tops like stone dreams, their ruins haunted by stories of knights and ladies, of feudal splendor and medieval magic. But rather than feeling diminished by comparison with such antiquity, Irving began to understand that every landscape had its own capacity for enchantment. The Hudson Valley might lack ancient castles, but it possessed its own sublime beauty, its own capacity to inspire awe and wonder. The Gothic revival that was sweeping European literature in the early 19th century provided another crucial influence. Irving read the novels of Anne Radcliffe and Horace Walpole, stories that found horror and beauty in crumbling ruins and moonlit corridors. But he also recognized that Gothic literature was, at its heart, about the persistence of the past in the present, about the way history refused to stay safely buried. This insight would prove crucial to his understanding of American Gothic, the recognition that even a young country could produce its own ghosts, its own haunted places. It was during his European sojourn that Irving began work on what would become the Sketchbook, the collection that would contain The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and establish his international reputation. But the seeds of those stories were planted not in European soil, but in his homesickness for America. Distance had given him perspective on his native land, had helped him see its unique qualities more clearly. The Hudson Valley, viewed from the ancient libraries of German universities, began to seem not provincial, but pastoral, not lacking in history, but possessed of a different kind of story altogether. The collaborative spirit he encountered in European literary circles also influenced his approach to storytelling. Writers there understood themselves as part of a tradition, as inheritors and transmitters of cultural wisdom rather than mere entertainers. Irving began to see his role not just as an individual artist, but as someone charged with helping to create America's literary heritage, with finding ways to transform the raw material of American experience into stories that would endure. As his European stay lengthened, it would ultimately span 17 years, Irving found himself in the curious position of becoming America's literary ambassador to the Old World. European readers were hungry for authentic American stories, but they wanted tales that satisfied their romantic expectations of the New World. Irving learned to navigate this delicate balance, creating stories that were genuinely American, yet accessible to international readers, that captured the unique flavor of American life while speaking to universal human experiences. The challenge was particularly acute when it came to the supernatural elements that European readers expected in their literature. America lacked the ancient graveyards and ruined abbeys that provided such atmospheric settings for European ghost stories. But Irving began to realize that American supernatural tales could draw their power from different sources, from the vast wilderness that still covered most of the continent, from the collision between different cultural traditions, from the very newness that made everything seem possible, even the impossible. When he finally began to write The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Irving brought to the task everything he had learned during his European years. He understood how folklore functioned in traditional societies, how stories could serve multiple purposes simultaneously, entertaining while educating, frightening while comforting, preserving the past while speaking to present concerns. He had seen how landscape and legend could reinforce each other, how the physical environment could be made to serve the purposes of storytelling. But most importantly, he had gained the confidence to trust his own vision, to believe that American stories could stand alongside the best that European literature had to offer. The mist-shrouded valleys of the Hudson might lack the dramatic grandeur of the Rhine, but they possessed their own quiet magic. The Dutch settlers of colonial New York might seem prosaic compared to medieval knights, but their stories revealed the same fundamental truths about human nature, the same eternal struggles between reason and superstition, courage and fear, the known and the unknowable. As Irving prepared to transform his European experiences into American literature, he carried with him not just technical knowledge about the craft of storytelling, but a deeper understanding of literature's role in shaping cultural identity. He had seen how stories could give meaning to landscape, how they could transform ordinary places into sites of significance, how they could help people understand their relationship to the past and their responsibilities to the future. The time was approaching when all these influences would crystallize into the tale that would make him immortal, the story of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman. But first, the various elements needed to simmer in his imagination, like ingredients in a witch's cauldron, waiting for the right moment to be combined into a brew that would enchant readers for generations to come. The European sojourn was ending, but its influence would echo through every word of the legend he was preparing to create. As the 1810s melted into the 1820s, Washington Irving found himself drawn repeatedly to a particular stretch of the Hudson Valley, a landscape that seemed to exist outside the ordinary flow of time. Here, where the great river curved through rolling hills clothed in ancient forests, Dutch settlers had established communities that remained largely unchanged since the 17th century. The very air seemed heavy with stories, thick with the accumulated memories of generations who had worked this soil, watched these seasons turn, and passed down tales that grew richer with each telling. The region's peculiar character stemmed from its unique history. Unlike the bustling urban centers that were rapidly modernizing along the eastern seaboard, this section of the Hudson Valley remained a pastoral backwater, sheltered by geography and inclination from the transforming winds of the 19th century. The old Dutch families, the Van Tassels, the Van Rensselaers, the Van der Bergs, continued to farm their ancestral lands much as their great-grandparents had done, speaking a dialect that blended Dutch and English, English and Dutch, maintaining customs that seemed quaintly archaic to visitors from the cities. Irving often stayed at Sunnyside, his cottage in Tarrytown, a dwelling that seemed designed by Providence for a writer of atmospheric tales. The house nestled into the landscape like a natural growth, its Gothic revival windows framing views of the Hudson that changed with every shift of light and weather. From his study, Irving could look out across waters that had witnessed the passage of everything from Indian canoes to Dutch merchant vessels to the steamboats that were just beginning to transform river travel. It was a vantage point that seemed to exist at the intersection of all American history, past and present, flowing together like tributaries joining the main current. But it was not just the visual beauty of the region that captured Irving's imagination. It was the richness of its oral tradition. In the long winter evenings, when families gathered around their hearths and the wind whistled through the bare branches of the apple orchards, the old stories came alive. Irving quickly established himself as a welcome guest in Dutch farmhouses throughout the valley, where his reputation as a storyteller earned him admission to the inner circle of those who knew the region's most cherished and closely guarded tales. The stories he heard were unlike anything in the formal literature of the day. These were tales that had been shaped by the American experience, but retained the essential structure of European folklore. There were stories of hidden treasure buried by pirates along the river's banks, tales of Indian spirits that still walked the ancient hunting trails, legends of Revolutionary War soldiers who had never found their way home from the battlefield. But it was the ghost stories that particularly fascinated Irving, tales that seemed to spring directly from the misty hollows and shadowy glens that gave the region its distinctive character. The heart of this supernatural geography was a secluded valley known to the locals as Sleepy Hollow. The name itself seemed to encapsulate the drowsy, dreamlike quality that pervaded the entire region. Here, time moved differently. The very light seemed softer, filtered through ancient trees that had stood sentinel when the first Dutch settlers cleared their fields. The air was perpetually still, as if the valley existed in a pocket of eternal calm, protected from the restless energy that was transforming the rest of America. Local tradition held that Sleepy Hollow had been enchanted from the beginning, that there was something in the very soil and air that made it particularly susceptible to supernatural influences. The old Dutch settlers had recognized this immediately, noting how horses became skittish when passing through certain sections of the valley, how dogs refused to venture into specific groves, how even the most skeptical visitors found themselves glancing nervously over their shoulders when twilight fell across the hollow. The most persistent and widespread of all the local legends concerned a spectral horseman who was said to haunt the region's back roads and lonely paths. According to the stories Irving heard, this phantom was the ghost of a Hessian trooper who had lost his head to a cannonball during one of the Revolutionary War skirmishes that had swept through the valley. Unable to find peace in death, The soldier was doomed to ride eternally through the scenes of his former battles, searching for his missing head, or perhaps for some resolution to the conflict that had claimed his life. Different storytellers offered different versions of the legend. Some claimed the Headless Horseman appeared only on the anniversary of his death, rising from his grave in the old Dutch church cemetery to ride frantically through the night before returning to his rest at cockcrow. Others insisted he could be encountered on any dark night, particularly when the moon was shrouded by clouds and mist rose from the river to blur the boundaries between earth and sky. Still others maintained that the phantom horseman was not malevolent, but merely lost, a confused spirit seeking help from the living to find his way to whatever peace awaited beyond the grave. What all the stories shared was a vivid sense of place. The Headless Horseman was not a generic ghost who might appear anywhere, but a spirit specifically tied to this particular landscape. He rode the same roads the local farmers traveled, crossed the same streams, passed beneath the same ancient trees. The listeners could visualize his route because it followed familiar paths, and this geographical specificity gave the legend a credibility that more exotic supernatural tales lacked. This was not something that had happened in a distant fairy tale kingdom. This was something that could happen to anyone who found themselves alone on a dark night in their own neighborhood. Irving was particularly struck by the way the legend had adapted to local conditions while maintaining its essential European structure. The basic story, a headless horseman doomed to ride until he found peace, was clearly derived from old Germanic folklore that the Dutch settlers had brought with them to the New World. But the American version had taken on distinctly local characteristics. The ghost's identity as a Hessian soldier connected him to actual historical events that had taken place in the valley. His association with the old Dutch church gave the legend a specific geographical anchor. The details of his appearance and behavior reflected the particular landscape and culture of the Hudson Valley. This process of cultural adaptation fascinated Irving because it demonstrated how folklore continued to evolve and grow even in the New World. America might lack the centuries of accumulated legend that enriched European literature, but it possessed something perhaps more valuable: that to create new stories that spoke to contemporary concerns while drawing on ancient archetypal patterns. The Headless Horseman was both utterly American and timelessly universal, both historically specific and mythologically resonant. As Irving listened to these stories night after night, he began to envision how they might be transformed into literature without losing their essential character. The challenge was to capture not just the plot of the legend, but its atmosphere, the way it seemed to emerge naturally from the landscape, the way it reflected the values and concerns of the community that had shaped it, the way it balanced humor and horror, skepticism and belief, the rational and the supernatural. He also began to see how the story might serve as a vehicle for exploring larger themes about American identity. The Hudson Valley in the 1820s was a region in transition, caught between its Dutch colonial past and its American future. The old ways were giving way to new ones, but slowly and often reluctantly. This tension between tradition and progress, between the known and the unknown, between European heritage and American possibility seemed perfectly embodied in the figure of the Headless Horseman, a ghost from the old world haunting the landscape of the new. Irving understood that his task was not simply to record the folk tales he was hearing, but to transform them into something that would speak to readers far removed from the Hudson Valley. Readers who had never heard the wind whistle through the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery or seen mist rise from the Pocantico Creek. He needed to create a story that would make universal the very specific magic he had discovered in this particular corner of America. The inspiration for his approach came from his realization that every reader had experienced something equivalent to Sleepy Hollow, some place where the ordinary world seemed to thin, where the impossible felt possible, where ancient fears and longings stirred in the depths of the modern mind. His story would work by awakening these half-remembered sensations, by making readers feel that they, too, had ridden through a landscape where legends walked the earth with the confidence of old residents welcoming newcomers to their ancient home. As autumn approached, that season when the veil between worlds grows thin, Irving felt the time was right to begin setting down the tale that had been gathering in his imagination like mist collecting in a hollow. The whispers he had heard would soon become literature. The local legend would become a story for all time, and the Headless Horseman would begin his eternal ride not just through the valleys of the Hudson, but through the landscape of the American imagination. In the candlelit quiet of his study at Sunnyside, Washington Irving sat surrounded by the tools of his trade. Quills sharpened to perfect points, bottles of ink that gleamed like black mirrors in the lamplight, and sheets of paper that seemed to glow with possibility in the gathering dusk. Outside his windows, the Hudson Valley settled into its evening rhythm, the last light fading from the river and the first stars beginning to appear in a sky the color of pewter. It was the perfect hour for summoning ghosts, for breathing life into legends, for transforming the whispered stories of a drowsy Dutch settlement into literature that would endure long after the last candle had flickered out. The challenge before Irving was more complex than it might have appeared to a casual observer. He possessed a treasure trove of local folklore, rich with atmosphere and steeped in the unique character of the Hudson Valley. But transforming oral tradition into written literature required more than simple transcription. The living quality of a story told by firelight, the way the narrator's voice could rise and fall with the drama, the way listeners could participate with gasps and knowing nods, the way the physical environment itself became part of the tale. All of this had to be captured somehow in silent marks upon a page. Irving understood that his story needed to work on multiple levels simultaneously. It had to satisfy readers seeking simple entertainment, those hungry for a good ghost story to thrill them on a dark night. But it also needed to speak to more sophisticated literary sensibilities, to offer depths of meaning that would reward careful reading and rereading. Most challenging of all, it had to accomplish these goals while remaining true to the spirit of the oral tradition from which it sprang, preserving the gentle humor, the skeptical wisdom, and the profound understanding of human nature that made the original folk tales so enduring. His solution was to create a narrative voice that could bridge these different requirements, a storyteller who was simultaneously insider and outsider, believer and skeptic, sophisticated literary craftsman and simple purveyor of local legends. This narrator would present the tale of a Sleepy Hollow not as historical fact or pure fantasy, but as something in between, a story that might be true, that deserved consideration even if it stretched the boundaries of credibility, that contained wisdom regardless of its literal accuracy. The choice of Diedrich Knickerbocker as narrator was inspired. This fictional Dutch antiquarian, whom Irving had created for his earlier History of New York, possessed the perfect credentials for telling such a tale. As a supposed descendant of the original Dutch settlers, Knickerbocker had access to the authentic local traditions. As a scholar and gentleman, he possessed the education and literary skill necessary to present these traditions in polished prose. As a character in his own right, he could serve as a filter through which the story passed, adding layers of meaning and interpretation while maintaining the essential spirit of the original legend. Knickerbocker's tone throughout the tale would be crucial to its success. Irving crafted a voice that was simultaneously learned and folksy, sophisticated and humble, authoritative and self-deprecating. The narrator would present his story with the confidence of one who had heard it from reliable sources, but he would also acknowledge the possibility that skeptical readers might find it difficult to believe. This careful balance between assertion and qualification would allow readers to engage with the tale on their own terms. Those inclined toward belief could accept it as authentic folklore, while skeptics could enjoy it as an entertaining fiction without feeling insulted by demands for literal credence. The structure of the tale itself required equally careful consideration. Irving needed to create a story that built slowly toward its supernatural climax, establishing character and atmosphere with the patience of a master chef preparing a complex dish. The legend of the Headless Horseman could not simply be presented as an isolated ghost story. It needed to emerge naturally from the world of Sleepy Hollow, to feel like an inevitable product of that particular time and place. Irving's genius lay in his decision to make the story as much about the community that created and preserved the legend as about the legend itself. By taking time to establish the drowsy, dreamlike character of Sleepy Hollow and its inhabitants, he created a context in which supernatural events seemed not just possible, but almost expected. The valley's atmosphere of enchantment needed to be so thoroughly established that readers would feel they had entered a realm where the ordinary rules of reality might not fully apply. The character of Ichabod Crane posed particular challenges. Irving needed a protagonist who could serve both as a figure of fun and as a genuine object of sympathy, someone whose ultimate fate would satisfy readers' desire for poetic justice while not completely alienating their human sympathies. Crane needed to be ridiculous enough that his eventual comeuppance would seem deserved, but human enough that readers would feel some concern for his welfare. Irving's solution was to make Ichabod a character whose flaws were as much comic as truly objectionable. His superstition, his gluttony, his social pretensions, his romantic delusions, all of these failings were presented with a light touch that invited laughter rather than condemnation. Ichabod became a figure representing certain universal human weaknesses: greed, vanity, cowardice, but he was drawn with enough sympathy that readers could recognize something of themselves in his predicament. The relationship between Ichabod and Brom Bones required equally delicate handling. Irving needed to create a rivalry that would provide the story's dramatic engine while avoiding the extremes of either melodrama or farce. Brom could not be simply a bully, or readers might sympathize too strongly with Ichabod. Nor could he be merely a practical joker, or the story's darker implications might be lost. Irving's solution was to make Brom a representative of a different set of values: local, traditional, rooted in the land and its customs, that stood in natural opposition to Ichabod's outsider status and social ambitions. The supernatural elements of the tale presented perhaps the greatest technical challenge. Irving needed to create a ghost story that would satisfy readers who came to it seeking thrills, but he also wanted to leave room for rational explanation of the apparently supernatural events. The ambiguity needed to be carefully maintained. The story had to be convincing, whether read as an authentic encounter with the supernatural or as an elaborate practical joke played by Brom Bones and his companions. This ambiguity served multiple purposes. It allowed readers of different temperaments and beliefs to engage with the story on their own terms. It reflected the sophisticated literary taste of the early 19th century, which preferred suggestion to explicit statement, atmosphere to graphic description. Most importantly, it captured something essential about folklore itself: the way traditional stories operate in a space between fact and fiction, history and myth, belief and skepticism. Irving also understood that the story's setting needed to be more than merely atmospheric. It needed to function as an active participant in the narrative. The landscape of Sleepy Hollow, with its misty hollows and whispering trees, its ancient church and shadowy cemetery, its winding roads and rushing streams, would become as much a character as any of the human protagonists. Every element of the natural environment would contribute to the story's overall effect, creating a world in which the supernatural seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The tale's conclusion required perhaps the most delicate touch of all. Irving needed to resolve the narrative in a way that satisfied the story's dramatic requirements, while preserving its essential ambiguity. Ichabod's disappearance had to feel like both poetic justice and genuine mystery, the triumph of local traditions over outside interference, and the possible intervention of supernatural forces. The ending needed to provide closure while leaving room for speculation, to answer the story's central questions while raising new ones. As Irving worked through these challenges, he was creating more than just an entertaining tale. He was establishing a template for American literature that would influence writers for generations to come. His careful balance of humor and horror, his respectful treatment of folklore, his creation of characters who were both individual and representative, his use of landscape as both setting and symbol. All of these elements would become hallmarks of the distinctly American literary tradition he was helping to establish. The autumn nights grew longer as Irving labored over his tale, the candlelight flickering across pages that gradually filled with the story that would make him immortal. Outside his study windows, the Hudson Valley, settled deeper into the season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, as if the landscape itself were preparing to receive the legend that would transform it from a simple geographical location into a permanent fixture of the American imagination. The writer worked in the shadows, but he was creating something that would shine with its own light for centuries to come. The season had turned, as it always does in the Hudson Valley, with a gentleness that makes the transformation seem like magic rather than mere meteorology. September had painted the first tentative strokes of gold and crimson across the maple leaves, and now October was completing the masterpiece, turning the entire valley into a canvas of colors so rich and varied that they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The air carried the sweet scent of ripening apples from orchards that had been tended by the same families for generations, and there was a quality to the light, soft, golden, nostalgic, that made even the most prosaic activities seem touched with a poetry. It was in this season of natural enchantment that the tale of Ichabod Crane would unfold, as if autumn itself had conspired to provide the perfect setting for a story that would blur the boundaries between the everyday world and the realm of spirits. The very landscape seemed to invite belief in the impossible, to suggest that on such nights, when mist rose from the river and shadows danced beneath the moon, the normal rules that governed the world might be temporarily suspended. In the secluded glen known as Sleepy Hollow, the atmosphere was particularly potent. Here, where Pocantico Creek wound through meadows that hadn't changed since the first Dutch settlers cleared them from the primeval forest, time seemed to move at its own unhurried pace. The old church stood on its hill, like a sentinel from another century, its weathered stones bearing witness to the passage of generations. The graveyard that surrounded it was filled with graves bearing names that echoed the valley's Dutch heritage: Van Tassel, Van Ripper, Van der Berg, families whose roots in this soil ran as deep as the ancient oaks that shaded their final resting places. It was here, in this drowsy realm where the past seemed more real than the present, that Ichabod Crane had established himself as the local schoolmaster. Picture him, if you will, as he made his way along the country roads in the early morning light. A figure so angular and elongated that he seemed less like a man than like a walking scarecrow that had somehow acquired the gift of motion. His limbs appeared to have been assembled from spare parts, each one belonging to a different, larger person. And when he walked, they moved with a loose, ungainly coordination that made observers think of a marionette being manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Ichabod's face was equally distinctive, long and narrow, with a nose so prominent it seemed to arrive at its destination several moments before the rest of him. His eyes, small and bright, darted constantly from side to side, taking in every detail of his surroundings with the hungry intensity of one who lived more in his imagination than in the physical world. When he spoke, which he did frequently, and at considerable length, his voice carried the nasal twang of his native Connecticut, marking him immediately as an outsider in this Dutch enclave, where even third-generation families were still considered newcomers. The schoolhouse where Ichabod held court was a testament to the community's no-nonsense approach to education. Built of logs chinked with clay, it contained a single room heated by a fireplace that seemed perpetually to be either too hot or too cold, never achieving that perfect temperature that might have made learning comfortable. The benches were crude affairs, hewn from local timber and innocent of any concession to comfort, arranged in rows that faced the master's desk with the rigid formality of soldiers on parade. But if the physical environment was Spartan, the intellectual atmosphere was rich with the kind of learning that nourished the imagination as much as the mind. Ichabod was, whatever his faults, a devoted teacher who brought to his work a genuine love of books and stories. His pupils learned their letters and numbers, to be sure, but they also absorbed something more valuable, a sense that the world was full of wonders, that knowledge could be its own reward, that the realm of books and stories offered treasures more precious than any material wealth. The schoolmaster's reputation extended far beyond his pedagogical duties. Throughout the valley, he was known as a man who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of supernatural lore, a walking compendium of ghost stories, witch tales, and accounts of mysterious phenomena. Farmers would invite him to their hearths on winter evenings, not just for the pleasure of his company, but for the delicious terror he could inspire with his tales of haunted houses, spectral appearances, and unexplained events that defied rational explanation. Ichabod's credulous nature made him the perfect audience for such stories, but it also made him their perfect transmitter. He believed every tale he heard with the fervor of a true convert, and his belief gave power to his retelling. When Ichabod spoke of ghosts, his listeners could see the spirits moving in the shadows beyond the firelight. When he described supernatural encounters, the very air seemed to grow colder, and even the most skeptical farmers found themselves glancing nervously toward darkened windows. This reputation for supernatural knowledge brought Ichabod a particular kind of authority in the community. While the local minister might speak with confidence about the next world, Ichabod seemed to possess inside information about the traffic between worlds, about the spirits that refused to stay decently buried, about the phenomena that proved the universe contained more mysteries than any rational philosophy could explain. In a community that was deeply religious, but also profoundly superstitious, such knowledge commanded respect as well as fascination. But it was not just his storytelling abilities that made Ichabod a welcome guest in Dutch farmhouses throughout the valley. The schoolmaster possessed another talent that endeared him to the local families, an appetite that seemed to have no bottom, combined with an appreciation for good cooking that bordered on the religious. In a culture that measured hospitality by the quantity and quality of food offered to guests, Ichabod's ability to consume vast quantities of Dutch delicacies, while praising each dish with genuine enthusiasm, made him a perfect dinner companion. The abundance of the Hudson Valley seemed designed to tempt such an appetite. Every farmhouse kitchen was a temple dedicated to the culinary arts, presided over by Dutch housewives who took fierce pride in their traditional recipes. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted fowl and joints of meat, fresh-baked bread and churned butter, preserves made from fruit grown in their own orchards, vegetables pulled that morning from their own gardens. To Ichabod, each meal was a revelation, a confirmation that he had found his way to a kind of earthly paradise where the fruits of the earth were transformed by skill and tradition into sustenance fit for the gods. This appreciation for material comforts extended beyond mere food to encompass the entire lifestyle that the prosperous Dutch farmers had created in their corner of America. Ichabod looked with longing eyes upon their substantial houses, their well-stocked barns, their fields heavy with grain, their orchards laden with fruit. Here was wealth that seemed to grow directly from the soil, prosperity that required no complicated commercial ventures, no risky investments, no dependence upon the vagaries of distant markets. Here was the kind of solid, tangible success that even a Connecticut schoolmaster might aspire to achieve. And so Ichabod began to dream dreams that extended far beyond his modest role as village pedagogue. He began to envision himself as a man of property, a landowner with acres of his own, a figure of substance in the community rather than merely its hired instructor. These dreams centered increasingly upon a particular farm, a particular fortune, and most particularly upon a particular young woman whose beauty and inheritance seemed to offer the key to all his ambitions. Katrina Van Tassel was the only child of Baltus Van Tassel, one of the wealthiest farmers in the valley, and she had grown to young womanhood surrounded by all the abundance that her father's prosperity could provide. At 18, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed uniquely suited to her environment, not the pale, ethereal loveliness that poets celebrated, but a robust, healthy attractiveness that spoke of good blood, good food, and the confidence that came from never having known want. Her cheeks held the rose-petal flush that came from outdoor exercise in the clean country air. Her figure showed the pleasing plumpness that was then considered the height of feminine appeal, and her manner combined natural grace with the self-assurance of one who had been cherished from birth. But it was not just Katrina's personal charms that attracted Ichabod's attention. It was everything she represented. When he looked at her, he saw not just a beautiful young woman, but the embodiment of all the prosperity and security he longed to possess. In his mind's eye, he could see himself as master of the Van Tassel estate, directing the work of the farm, presiding over dinners that would make his current meals seem like mere snacks, respected and prosperous in a way that no schoolmaster could ever hope to be. These romantic dreams were encouraged by Katrina's apparent willingness to receive his attentions. She seemed to welcome his visits to the Van Tassel farm, to enjoy his company during the social gatherings that were a regular feature of valley life, to appreciate the gallant compliments he paid her with the elaborate courtesy he had learned from his reading of romantic literature. To Ichabod, her smiles and kind words seemed to promise eventual acceptance of his suit, confirmation that his dreams of advancement might actually be realized. But Ichabod was not the only young man in the valley who had noticed Katrina's charms. There was a rival for her affections, and this rival possessed advantages that no amount of book learning or supernatural knowledge could overcome. Abraham Van Brunt, known to his friends as Brom Bones, was everything that Ichabod wasn't: young, strong, handsome, and possessed of the kind of easy confidence that came from never having doubted his place in the world. Where Ichabod was angular and awkward, Brom was broad-shouldered and graceful. Where the schoolmaster was pale and scholarly, Brom was tanned and athletic, his face bearing the healthy color of one who spent his days in outdoor pursuits, where Ichabod moved through the world with the careful steps of one who had learned not to expect too much from life. Brom strode with the confidence of one who had always found the world ready to grant his wishes. But the contrast between the two men extended beyond mere physical differences. They represented different visions of what it meant to be American, different relationships to the past and future, different ways of understanding one's place in the rapidly changing world of the early 19th century. Ichabod embodied the forces of progress and change, education, improvement, the belief that a man might rise above his origins through application and merit. Brom represented tradition and continuity, the values of a settled community, the wisdom of established customs, the conviction that the old ways had proven their worth through the test of time. In their rivalry for Katrina's hand, these two philosophies would clash with consequences that neither could have anticipated. The contest would be decided not in any formal duel or open competition, but in the misty darkness of an autumn night when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grew thin, and the legends of Sleepy Hollow would intrude upon the lives of the living with results that would become legend themselves. As the October nights grew longer and the autumn mists gathered more thickly in the hollows, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the romantic fate of three young people, but the larger question of which vision of America would triumph in this particular corner of the Hudson Valley. The season of harvest was drawing to its close, but the most important reaping was yet to come. As the decades passed and the legend of Sleepy Hollow found its way into the hearts and minds of readers across America and beyond, the tale began to reveal depths of meaning that perhaps even its creator had not fully recognized. Like all great stories, Irving's masterpiece proved to be a kind of mirror, reflecting the concerns and preoccupations of each generation that encountered it, speaking to universal human experiences while remaining firmly rooted in its particular time and place. The most obvious interpretation, and the one that Irving himself seemed to encourage, was that the story served as a gentle satire of certain American character types and social pretensions. Ichabod Crane, with his book Learning and Social Ambitions, represented the kind of outsider who comes to an established community with grand plans for improvement and advancement, only to discover that the locals have their own ways of dealing with presumptuous newcomers. In this reading, the tale becomes a celebration of traditional values over innovation, of community wisdom over individual ambition, of authentic belonging over superficial social climbing. But even this relatively straightforward interpretation reveals layers of complexity upon closer examination. Irving was not simply endorsing a conservative rejection of change and progress. He was exploring the tensions that arose when different value systems came into conflict. Ichabod's defeat is satisfying partly because of his comic flaws, but it is also tinged with melancholy because he represents genuine virtues, learning, curiosity, imagination, that the community seems unwilling to appreciate. The story suggests that America's democratic ideals of social mobility and self-improvement might be more difficult to realize in practice than in theory. The tale also functioned as a meditation on the relationship between Old World and New World cultures, between European traditions and American innovations. The Dutch settlers of Sleepy Hollow had successfully transplanted their customs and values to American soil, creating a community that preserved the best of their heritage while adapting to local conditions. Ichabod, despite being native-born, represents a different kind of European influence, the bookish, theoretical approach to life that prizes abstract knowledge over practical wisdom, individual advancement over communal harmony. In this context, the Headless Horseman becomes more than just a ghost story device. He becomes a symbol of how the past continues to shape the present, how history refuses to stay safely buried in books and monuments, but continues to exert influence on the living world. The Phantom's identity as a Hessian soldier connects him to the violence that gave birth to the American nation, while his headless condition suggests the confusion and disorientation that war inevitably produces. His eternal ride through the peaceful valleys of post-war America implies that the trauma of national birth cannot be easily forgotten or overcome. Religious and philosophical interpretations of the story have proven equally rich. The tale can be read as a meditation on the nature of belief itself, on the ways that faith and superstition, reason and imagination compete for dominance in human consciousness. Ichabod's credulous acceptance of supernatural tales contrasts with the more pragmatic skepticism of characters like Brom Bones, but neither position is clearly endorsed by the narrative. The story's famous ambiguity: was the Headless Horseman real or merely Brom in disguise, reflects a deeper uncertainty about the nature of truth and the reliability of human perception. This ambiguity was particularly meaningful to readers in the early 19th century, when traditional religious certainties were being challenged by new scientific discoveries and philosophical systems. The story offered no easy answers about what to believe, but it suggested that mystery and wonder had their own value, that a world explained entirely by reason and science might be a poorer place than one that left room for the supernatural, the inexplicable, the magical. The tale's treatment of gender roles and romantic relationships also invited interpretation and reinterpretation as social attitudes evolved. Katrina Van Tassel, seemingly passive and ornamental in the original story, could be read as representing different ideals of femininity depending on the reader's perspective. To some, she embodied the domestic virtues that were considered the highest achievement of womanhood: beauty, grace, the ability to inspire masculine devotion and competition. To others, her apparent encouragement of both suitors seemed to reveal a more complex character, perhaps a young woman who understood her own value and was determined to make the best possible match for herself. The economic dimensions of the story proved increasingly relevant as America industrialized and questions of wealth, class, and social mobility became more pressing. Ichabod's dreams of marrying into prosperity reflected the ambitions of countless Americans who saw marriage as a route to social advancement. His defeat suggested the limits of such strategies, the ways that established elites might protect themselves against ambitious outsiders. The Van Tassel farm, with its abundant harvests and comfortable prosperity, represented an ideal of American success that was already becoming harder to achieve as the country urbanized and modernized. Literary scholars found in the story a masterful example of how folklore could be transformed into sophisticated literature without losing its essential character. Irving's achievement was to create a tale that worked simultaneously as entertainment and art, that satisfied both popular and elite audiences, that preserved the wisdom of oral tradition while demonstrating the unique capabilities of written narrative. The story's structure, with its careful build-up of atmosphere, its precise characterization, and its perfectly timed revelation, became a model for short fiction that influenced writers for generations to come. The tale's exploration of the relationship between individual psychology and community mythology proved particularly fascinating to readers influenced by emerging theories of human behavior. Ichabod's supernatural experiences could be interpreted as projections of his own fears and guilt, manifestations of a psyche that had been shaped by the stories he consumed so eagerly. In this reading, the Headless Horseman becomes less an external threat than an internal one, a symbol of the ways that imagination, unchecked by judgment and moderated by common sense, could lead to delusion and self-destruction. Regional interpretations of the story emphasized its role in establishing a sense of place, in transforming the Hudson Valley from a simple geographical location into a landscape charged with literary and cultural significance. Irving's detailed descriptions of local customs, architecture, and natural beauty helped create what would become known as the Irving tradition in American writing, the conviction that American places and people were worthy subjects for serious literature, that native materials could produce art equal to anything imported from Europe. The story's influence on the development of American Gothic literature cannot be overstated. Irving demonstrated how supernatural tales could be adapted to American settings and concerns, how the essential elements of Gothic fiction, mystery, terror, the intrusion of the past into the present, could be domesticated without being diminished. Later writers would follow his example, finding in American history and landscape the materials for stories that were both authentically native and universally compelling. As the tale continued to be read and reread, adapted and reimagined, it became clear that its deepest meaning lay not in any single interpretation, but in its capacity to generate multiple meanings, to speak to different readers in different ways, while maintaining its essential integrity. Like the mists that gathered in the real Sleepy Hollow, the story's meanings shifted and changed with the light of different perspectives, revealing new aspects of truth, while never fully surrendering their mystery. The echoes of Irving's tale would continue to resonate through American culture, influencing not just literature, but art, music, and eventually film and television. Each generation would find in the story of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman something that spoke to their particular concerns and preoccupations, ensuring that what began as a local legend in a drowsy Dutch settlement would become a permanent part of the American cultural heritage, as enduring as the landscape that inspired it, and as mysterious as the mists that rise from the Hudson River on autumn nights when the boundary between worlds grows thin. In the deeper reaches of midnight, when even the most devoted revelers have surrendered to sleep, and the world belongs to shadows and silence, the true story of the Headless Horseman begins to unfold. It is a tale that has been told and retold so many times that it has acquired the patina of myth, each telling adding new details while preserving the essential core of terror and mystery that makes the legend immortal. Yet to understand the full power of this phantom rider, we must look beyond the familiar narrative of Irving's story to explore the darker currents that flow beneath its surface. The historical figure who would become the Headless Horseman was, according to the most persistent local traditions, a Hessian trooper named Klaus Möller, though some accounts give different names and others suggest that his identity was lost along with his head in the chaos of battle. He had come to America not from any conviction about the righteousness of the British cause, but simply because he was a professional soldier who sold his services to whoever would pay for them. Like thousands of his countrymen, he had been recruited from the ranks of the German military to serve King George's interests in the rebellious colonies, carrying with him the discipline and ruthlessness that made Hessian soldiers both feared and effective. Möller had fought in several engagements before arriving in the Hudson Valley, gaining a reputation for both skill and savagery that preceded him like a dark herald. Local accounts, passed down through families who remembered the war years, described him as a man who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the business of killing, who approached combat with the enthusiasm that others reserved for sports or entertainment. His favorite weapon was a heavy saber that he wielded with the expertise of long practice, and he was known to collect trophies from fallen enemies, buttons, buckles, sometimes more grisly souvenirs that marked his passage through the countryside. The engagement that would claim his life took place during one of the many small skirmishes that characterized the war in the Hudson Valley, where irregular forces on both sides conducted a campaign of raids and ambushes that blurred the line between military action and banditry. Miller had been part of a Hessian patrol that was attempting to capture or destroy a supply depot that the Continental forces had established near the old Dutch church. The mission should have been routine. The Americans were lightly defended, and the element of surprise was on the Hessian side. But war has its own logic, and even the best-planned operations can spiral into chaos with terrifying speed. The American defenders, warned of the approaching attack by local sympathizers, had prepared an ambush of their own. As the Hessians approached through the morning mist, confident in their superior training and firepower, they were met by a devastating volley of musket fire from concealed positions. Several soldiers fell in the first exchange, and what should have been a quick victory turned into a desperate running battle through the woods and fields around the church. Müller found himself separated from the main body of his unit, pursuing what he thought was a fleeing American soldier through a grove of ancient oaks. The chase led him along a narrow path that wound between moss-covered stones and fallen logs, deeper into the shadowy wood, where the morning light barely penetrated the canopy of leaves. His horse, a magnificent black stallion that he had captured earlier in the campaign, moved with the sure-footed confidence of an animal accustomed to battle, its hooves making almost no sound on the soft earth of the forest floor. The American soldier he was chasing proved more elusive than expected, disappearing and reappearing among the trees like a phantom himself. Möller spurred his horse harder, driven by the kind of bloodlust that combat could inspire in certain men, determined to catch his prey before it could escape to warn others of the Hessian presence. His saber was drawn and ready, its blade gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight, and he could almost taste the satisfaction of another victory, another trophy to add to his collection. But the hunter had become the hunted without realizing it. The fleeing American was leading him directly into a carefully prepared trap where other Continental soldiers waited in concealment with their weapons trained on the path. The ambush was perfectly executed. As Muller's horse rounded a bend in the trail, a single shot rang out from the undergrowth, fired by a marksman who had been tracking his target for several minutes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The iron cannonball, for the Americans were using captured artillery pieces loaded with grapeshot and improvised projectiles, caught Muller precisely at the neck as he leaned forward in his saddle, urging his horse to greater speed. The impact was so sudden and violent that his head was severed completely, sent spinning through the air to land somewhere among the fallen leaves, while his body continued to ride for several more strides before toppling from the saddle. The horse, trained to respond to its rider's commands, and perhaps driven by some instinct beyond human understanding, continued to run even after its master had fallen. Local witnesses, those brave enough to venture near the scene after the shooting stopped, reported seeing the magnificent black stallion galloping through the woods with reins trailing and stirrups empty, moving with a purpose that seemed to transcend the merely physical. Some claimed that the headless body of the Hessian rider was still in the saddle, somehow maintaining its seat through sheer force of will or supernatural intervention. The body was eventually found and buried in the graveyard of the old Dutch church, though not before local soldiers had rifled through the dead man's possessions, claiming his weapons and personal effects as spoils of war. But the head was never recovered, despite extensive searches through the grove where the ambush had taken place. Some speculated that it had been carried off by wild animals, others that it had rolled into a deep ravine or hidden hollow where it would never be found. A few whispered that it had been taken by the Americans as a gruesome trophy, though no evidence ever supported this claim. It was perhaps a week after the burial that the first sightings began. Local farmers, returning home late from visits to neighboring homesteads, reported seeing a lone horseman riding through the night along the roads that connected the scattered settlements of the valley. At first, these encounters seemed unremarkable, a fellow traveler, perhaps, making his way home in the darkness. But as the reports accumulated, disturbing details began to emerge. The rider appeared always on the same magnificent black horse, dressed in the distinctive uniform of a Hessian soldier, but there was something wrong with his appearance that made observers' blood run cold. Where his head should have been, there was only empty air, a horrifying absence that seemed to draw the eye even as it repelled the mind. He carried his severed head tucked under one arm like a grisly parcel, and in his other hand was the same heavy saber that he had wielded in life, now gleaming with an otherworldly light that seemed to come from within the metal itself. The phantom's behavior followed certain patterns that gradually became familiar to those who lived in the area. He appeared most often on moonless nights, when the darkness was deepest and the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grew thin. His route seemed to follow the same paths he had ridden in life, connecting the scenes of his military service with the place of his death and burial. He rode always at a gallop, as if driven by some urgent mission that could not be delayed, and the sound of his horse's hooves could be heard from great distances, echoing through the valleys like thunder. Most terrifying of all were the accounts of direct encounters with the spectre. Those unfortunate enough to meet him on the road described the overwhelming sensation of supernatural dread that accompanied his presence, a coldness that seemed to penetrate not just the body, but the soul itself. His headless form radiated malevolence and confusion, the anger of a spirit that could not understand why it had been denied the peace of death, why it was condemned to ride eternally through landscapes that were no longer its own. Some witnesses claimed that the phantom would pursue lone travelers, chasing them through the night with relentless determination until they reached the safety of consecrated ground or crossed running water, elements that seemed to have power over supernatural beings. Others reported that he would simply appear beside them on the road, riding parallel for a time, before vanishing as suddenly as he had come, leaving behind only the memory of that terrible absence where a head should have been, and the lingering scent of gunpowder and grave earth. The legend grew and evolved with each telling, acquiring new details and variations as it passed from generation to generation. Some versions emphasized the Hessian's search for his missing head, suggesting that he was doomed to ride until he could recover the part of himself that had been lost in battle. Others portrayed him as a more malevolent spirit, actively seeking to harm the living or to recruit them for his eternal cavalry charge through the realms of the dead. Local ministers attempted to provide theological explanations for the phenomenon, suggesting that the Hessian's soul was trapped in purgatory, unable to find peace because of the violence he had committed in life, or because he had died without receiving the last rites of his church. More superstitious residents developed elaborate theories about the specific conditions that might summon the phantom or protect against him, creating a complex folklore around the proper behavior for anyone unfortunate enough to encounter him. As the years passed and the Revolutionary War became a matter of historical memory rather than lived experience, the figure of the Headless Horseman evolved from a specific manifestation of wartime trauma into something more universal, a symbol of the way that violence echoes through time, the way that the dead refuse to stay decently buried when they have unfinished business with the living. He became not just the ghost of one Hessian soldier, but the embodiment of all the fears and guilts that haunted the American consciousness, a reminder that the nation's birth had been purchased with blood, and that the cost of that violence could never be fully calculated or completely paid. In the hands of Washington Irving, this raw material of folklore would be transformed into literature, but the essential power of the legend, it's to make readers feel the presence of the supernatural in their own familiar world, would remain unchanged. The Headless Horseman would continue his eternal ride, not just through the valleys of the Hudson, but through the landscape of the American imagination, forever pursuing and forever pursued, forever seeking what could never be found forever reminding us that some hungers can never be satisfied, and some wounds can never heal. The Hudson Valley has always been a place where the extraordinary seems to lurk just beneath the surface of the ordinary, where mist-shrouded mornings and twilight shadows create an atmosphere in which anything might be possible. Long before Washington Irving transformed a local legend into immortal literature, this stretch of river valley between New York City and Albany possessed a quality that set it apart from other American landscapes: a sense of accumulated time, of stories layered upon stories, of human experience distilled into something approaching the mythical. The geographical features of the valley contribute significantly to its otherworldly atmosphere. The Hudson River itself, broad and mysterious, seems less like a simple waterway than like a boundary between different realms of experience. Its waters reflect the sky with such clarity that travelers often report feeling disoriented, unsure whether they are moving through the landscape or through some parallel world that exists in the space between earth and heaven. When mist rises from the river at dawn or dusk, it transforms familiar landmarks into something strange and wonderful, blurring the edges of reality until even the most skeptical observer begins to wonder what might be moving in those veils of vapor. The topography of the region enhances this sense of mystery. Rolling hills rise from the river's banks, covered with forests that seem to muffle sound and filter light in ways that create pockets of perpetual twilight. Valleys and hollows nestle between these hills, like cupped hands holding secrets, each one possessing its own microclimate, its own particular quality of stillness or movement, its own collection of stories passed down through generations of residents who understand that not all of these tales can be explained by reason alone. It was into this naturally atmospheric landscape that successive waves of human settlement brought their own contributions to the growing collection of mysteries. The original Native American inhabitants left behind not just physical traces, arrowheads and pottery shards, ancient trails and burial grounds, but something more intangible, yet perhaps more significant: a deep understanding of the land as a living entity possessed of its own consciousness and will. Their stories spoke of places where the spirits gathered, of natural features that served as gateways between worlds, of the need to approach certain locations with proper respect and ceremony. The Dutch settlers who arrived in the 17th century brought with them their own rich tradition of folklore, stories that had been shaped by centuries of European experience, but proved remarkably adaptable to American conditions. The ghosts and spirits of Dutch legend found new homes in Hudson Valley, farmhouses and forests, while new stories arose to explain the peculiar phenomena that seemed to characterize their adopted homeland. These early colonists understood that successful settlement required more than just clearing land and building houses. It demanded an accommodation with the mysterious forces that already inhabited the place, a recognition that some aspects of the landscape would always remain beyond human control or understanding. The Revolutionary War added another layer to the valley's supernatural reputation. Battlefields have always been considered liminal spaces, places where the boundary between life and death becomes permeable, and the Hudson Valley saw more than its share of skirmishes, ambushes, and acts of violence during the struggle for independence. every engagement left behind not just casualty lists and historical records, but stories of strange encounters, unexplained phenomena, and ghostly apparitions that suggested the dead were not resting quietly in their graves. Local tradition held that certain locations in the valley were particularly susceptible to supernatural manifestations. The old Dutch church and its surrounding graveyard figured prominently in these accounts, partly because of its age and historical significance, but also because something about the site itself seemed to attract otherworldly attention. Built on a rise of ground that commanded a view of the surrounding countryside, the church occupied what had long been considered sacred space, a place where different worlds intersected and communication between them became possible. The bridge that carried the main road across the Pocantico Creek below the church became another focal point for supernatural activity. Bridges, in folklore, are traditionally places of power and danger, thresholds between different states of being, where travelers must pay tolls not just to human authorities, but to spiritual forces as well. The fact that this particular bridge stood at the foot of the church hill, within sight of the graves of the war dead, made it seem an especially appropriate place for encounters with the supernatural. The natural acoustics of the valley contributed to its reputation as a haunted landscape. Sound travels strangely in this terrain, echoing off hillsides and water in ways that can make a distant voice seem close at hand or transform the ordinary noises of rural life into something ominous and threatening. Horse hooves on a lonely road, the creaking of tree branches in the wind, the call of night birds. All of these sounds took on different meanings when heard in the darkness of a Hudson Valley night, becoming potential harbingers of supernatural visitation. The seasonal cycle of the valley enhanced its mystical qualities. Spring brought mists that rose from the warming earth to shroud familiar landmarks in veils of vapor, creating an atmosphere in which the most practical farmers found themselves wondering what shapes might be moving in the whiteness. Summer offered long twilights when the boundary between day and night seemed to stretch indefinitely, creating extended periods of uncertainty when anything might happen. Autumn, with its spectacular display of changing foliage, transformed the entire landscape into something that seemed too beautiful to be entirely natural, as if the valley had been touched by supernatural artistry. But it was winter that truly revealed the valley's otherworldly character. Snow simplified the landscape to its essential elements, creating a stark beauty that seemed to belong more to fairyland than to the workaday world of American agriculture. Bare trees took on fantastic shapes that imagination could easily transform into supernatural beings, while the silence that snow brought to the land seemed to invite whispers from worlds beyond the physical. On clear winter nights, when the moon shone on snow-covered fields and ice-crusted streams, the entire valley took on an ethereal quality that made even the most mundane activities seem charged with mystery. The architectural heritage of the region contributed to its supernatural atmosphere. The old Dutch houses, with their distinctive gambrel roofs and weathered stonework, seemed to grow from the landscape like natural features, their small windows and massive chimneys giving them an expression that could appear either welcoming or forbidding, depending on the quality of light and the observer's state of mind. Many of these structures were old enough to have sheltered several generations of the same family, accumulating layers of human experience that seemed to permeate their very stones. The local population's attitude toward the supernatural helped maintain the valley's reputation as a haunted landscape. Unlike more recently settled regions, where folklore was viewed as old-fashioned superstition to be discarded in favor of modern rationality, the Hudson Valley maintained a comfortable relationship with its ghost stories and unexplained phenomena. Local families preserved these tales not as curiosities or entertainment, but as part of their cultural heritage, essential knowledge about the place they called home. This acceptance of the supernatural was neither naive credulity nor deliberate cultivation of mystery for its own sake. Instead, it represented a mature understanding that any landscape with sufficient history inevitably accumulates stories that cannot be easily explained, that the scientific revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, however valuable, could not answer every question about human experience in specific places. The residents of the Hudson Valley had learned to live comfortably with mystery, to accept that their home possessed qualities that could not be fully mapped or catalogued. Irving understood these qualities instinctively, perhaps because he had grown up in the region and absorbed its particular atmosphere as naturally as he breathed its air. When he came to write The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, he did not need to create an artificial sense of mystery or import supernatural elements from other traditions. Instead, he simply drew upon the natural characteristics of the landscape and the accumulated wisdom of its inhabitants, trusting that readers would recognize the authenticity of what he described because it corresponded to places and phenomena they had encountered in their own experience. The genius of Irving's approach lay in his recognition that the Hudson Valley's supernatural reputation grew not from any single dramatic event or overwhelming manifestation, but from the accumulation of small mysteries, subtle anomalies, and half-glimpsed possibilities that made up the daily experience of living in such a place. His story worked because it presented the supernatural not as something alien and threatening, but as a natural extension of the landscape's already mysterious character, as inevitable as mist rising from the river or leaves changing color in the fall. In transforming local folklore into literature, Irving ensured that the Hudson Valley would forever occupy a special place in the American imagination. Readers who had never seen the region could visualize it clearly, because his descriptions captured not just its physical appearance, but its essential spirit, the quality that made it seem like a place where legends might come to life. Travelers who later visited the area often reported feeling that they had entered familiar territory, that Irving's words had somehow prepared them for the experience of moving through a landscape where the past seemed more present than in other places, where stories lived and breathed with the confidence of old residents welcoming newcomers to their ancient home. As the 19th century unfolded and America grew from a young republic into a mature nation, Washington Irving found himself occupying a unique position in the cultural landscape he had helped to create. The legend of Sleepy Hollow, along with its companion tale, Rip Van Winkle, in The Sketchbook, had established him as America's first internationally recognized man of letters, proof that the New World could produce literature worthy of European attention and respect. But the success that had made him famous also presented new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to shape the emerging American literary tradition. The immediate impact of Irving's success was to open doors that had previously been closed to American writers. European publishers, who had long dismissed American literature as a provincial curiosity, suddenly found themselves eager to acquire works by this charming author who could craft stories that appealed to both popular and sophisticated tastes. Irving became a literary ambassador, representing American culture abroad with a grace and wit that helped dispel European prejudices about the intellectual capacity of the former colonies. This international recognition brought practical benefits as well as prestige. For the first time, an American author could earn a comfortable living through writing alone, without needing to supplement literary income with other occupations. Irving's success demonstrated that American literature could be not just a cultural ornament, but a viable profession, encouraging other writers to pursue their craft with new confidence and dedication. The influence of Irving's work extended far beyond the merely commercial. His approach to storytelling, the careful balance of humor and pathos, the respectful treatment of folklore, the creation of characters who were both individual and representative, established templates that would influence American literature for generations. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, and even Herman Melville would draw upon techniques that Irving had pioneered, adapting his methods to their own purposes while extending the possibilities of American literary expression. Irving's treatment of American subject matter proved particularly influential. By demonstrating that native materials could be transformed into sophisticated literature, he encouraged other writers to explore their own regional traditions and local histories. The Hudson Valley might have provided the specific setting for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but the larger lesson was that every corner of America possessed its own stories worthy of literary attention. The result was a flowering of regional literature that would eventually create a truly national literary culture, rooted in the diverse experiences of the American people. The character of Irving's success also helped establish certain expectations about the role of the American writer in society. Unlike their European counterparts, who often positioned themselves as critics or revolutionaries, American authors were expected to serve as cultural ambassadors and national interpreters, helping both domestic and foreign audiences understand the meaning of the American experiment. Irving embraced this role with characteristic grace, using his platform to present America in the most favorable light, while never descending into mere boosterism or propaganda. His diplomatic career, which began in the 1820s with his appointment as attaché to the American legation in Spain, allowed him to serve his country in an official capacity while continuing his literary work. The combination of diplomatic service and authorship seemed natural for Irving, who had always understood literature as a bridge between different cultures and perspectives. His years in Spain produced Tales of the Alhambra, a collection that applied his proven formula of local folklore, transformed into sophisticated literature to Spanish rather than American materials. But it was his return to America in 1832, after 17 years abroad, that truly revealed the extent of his influence on American culture. Irving found himself treated as a returning hero, welcomed with the enthusiasm that demonstrated how deeply the legend of Sleepy Hollow and his other early works had penetrated the national consciousness. The Hudson Valley had become a pilgrimage destination for readers who wanted to see the landscapes that had inspired their favorite stories, while Sleepy Hollow itself had been transformed from a drowsy Dutch settlement into a site of literary significance. This transformation reflected a broader change in how Americans understood their cultural heritage. Irving's work had helped establish the idea that America possessed its own authentic traditions worthy of preservation and celebration. The colonial period, previously dismissed as merely prologue to independence, began to be viewed as a source of distinctive American stories and values. The Dutch settlers of the Hudson Valley, transformed by Irving's imagination from provincial farmers into literary characters, became symbols of American continuity and tradition. Irving's later years were marked by increasingly ambitious literary projects that drew upon his established reputation while exploring new directions. His biography of Christopher Columbus attempted to claim America's discovery as a subject worthy of epic treatment, while his multi-volume life of George Washington sought to create a definitive portrait of the nation's founding father. These works, while less enduringly popular than his early stories, demonstrated his continued commitment to using literature as a means of shaping American cultural identity. The construction of his home at Sunnyside, which he purchased and extensively renovated in the 1830s, became itself a kind of literary statement. The house was designed to embody the aesthetic principles that informed his writing, a harmonious blend of different cultural influences, respectful preservation of historical elements, combined with tasteful modern improvements, and above all, a sense of comfortable belonging to the Hudson Valley landscape. Sunnyside became a shrine to American literature, visited by admirers from around the world who wanted to see where the creator of Ichabod Crane had lived and worked. Irving's influence on popular culture extended far beyond the literary realm. The legend of Sleepy Hollow became a touchstone for American ideas about Halloween, helping to establish October 31st as a time for ghost stories and supernatural entertainment. The image of the Headless Horseman became one of the most recognizable figures in American folklore, inspiring countless adaptations, imitations, and variations. Stage productions, popular illustrations, and eventually film and television adaptations would ensure that Irving's creation remained a living part of American culture rather than a mere historical curiosity. The educational impact of Irving's work proved equally significant. The legend of Sleepy Hollow became a standard text in American schools, introducing generations of students to the possibilities of native literature while teaching them about their own cultural heritage. The story's accessible style and engaging plot made it an ideal vehicle for literary education, while its deeper themes provided material for more sophisticated analysis as students advanced in their studies. Irving's approach to regional identity also influenced how other parts of America understood and presented themselves. His success in transforming the Hudson Valley into a landscape charged with literary significance inspired similar efforts in New England, the South, and eventually the Western frontier. The idea that local stories and traditions could be transformed into national literature became a driving force in American cultural development, encouraging the preservation and celebration of regional diversity within the larger framework of national unity. The commercial success of Irving's work helped establish the infrastructure of American publishing. His negotiations with publishers, his understanding of copyright law, and his skill at marketing his own work created precedents that later authors would follow. The idea that literature could be a profitable profession, while not entirely new, gained credibility through Irving's example and encouraged the development of a more sophisticated literary marketplace. As Irving aged, he became increasingly conscious of his role as a founding father of American literature. His encouragement of younger writers, his support for literary institutions, and his continued advocacy for the importance of native literature helped ensure that the movement he had begun would continue beyond his own lifetime. Writers like Hawthorne and Melville acknowledged their debt to Irving's pioneering work, while new generations of readers discovered that American literature could offer experiences as rich and varied as any produced in the Old World. The cultural nationalism that Irving had helped to foster proved to be both blessing and burden for American literature. On one hand, it encouraged the development of a distinctive national voice and supported the idea that American experiences deserved serious literary treatment. On the other hand, it sometimes led to a defensiveness about American cultural achievements and an excessive concern with proving that native literature could rival European models. Irving himself seemed to understand these tensions, maintaining throughout his career a balanced perspective that celebrated American achievements while acknowledging the continued importance of European literary traditions. His work suggested that cultural maturity lay not in rejecting outside influences, but in synthesizing them with native materials to create something genuinely new and valuable. When Irving died in 1859, he left behind more than just a body of literary work. He'd helped to create the very concept of American literature as a distinct and valuable cultural phenomenon. His influence could be measured not just in sales figures or critical acclaim, but in the changed expectations that Americans brought to their own cultural productions. The idea that a story set in a sleepy Dutch settlement could become world literature had seemed unlikely when Irving began his career. But by the time of his death, it had become almost commonplace. The legacy of the dreamer from Manhattan extended far beyond his own lifetime, shaping how Americans understood their past, their landscape, and their cultural possibilities. In transforming local folklore into universal literature, Irving had demonstrated that the New World possessed its own capacity for enchantment, its own stories worthy of preservation and celebration. The mists that rose from the Hudson River would continue to inspire new generations of writers, but they would do so in a cultural landscape that Irving's imagination had fundamentally transformed. In the century and a half since Washington, Irving first conjured the Headless Horseman into literary existence. The legend of Sleepy Hollow has proven to possess that rarest of qualities in literature, the ability to transcend its original time and place while retaining the essential characteristics that made it meaningful to its first readers. Like all truly enduring stories, Irving's tale has shown a remarkable capacity for adaptation and reinterpretation, speaking to each new generation in its own language while preserving the core of mystery and wonder that first captured readers' imaginations. The story's journey from local folklore to international cultural phenomenon began almost immediately upon its publication in 1820. European readers, fascinated by this glimpse of American life and landscape, embraced the tale as confirmation that the New World could indeed produce literature worthy of serious attention. Translations appeared in multiple languages, each adding subtle variations that reflected the particular concerns and preoccupations of different national cultures. The universal appeal of the story, its exploration of themes like social ambition, romantic rivalry, and the tension between reason and superstition, ensured that it could speak meaningfully to readers regardless of their cultural background. The visual artists of the 19th century found in Irving's story a rich source of inspiration for their own creative work. Painters and illustrators competed to capture the dramatic moments of the tale, creating images that became almost as familiar as Irving's words themselves. The most successful of these artistic interpretations understood that the story's power lay not in any single dramatic moment, but in its overall atmosphere, its ability to transform familiar landscape into something charged with mystery and possibility. The theatrical adaptations that began appearing of the 1820s faced the challenge of translating Irving's carefully crafted prose into dramatic action without losing the story's essential quality of ambiguity. Early-stage versions tended to resolve the tale's central mystery in favor of either supernatural explanation or rational debunking, but the most successful productions learned to preserve Irving's delicate balance between belief and skepticism. The figure of the Headless Horseman presented particular challenges for stage designers who had to create an effect that would be both spectacular and credible within the constraints of 19th-century theatrical technology. As America industrialized and urbanized in the latter half of the 19th century, Irving's pastoral vision of the Hudson Valley began to acquire a nostalgic quality that enhanced rather than diminished its appeal. Readers living in increasingly crowded and mechanized environments found in Sleepy Hollow a refuge from the pressures of modern life, a reminder of an America that seemed simpler and more connected to the natural world. This nostalgic appeal was enhanced by the actual changes taking place in the Hudson Valley itself, as railroads and factories began to transform the landscape that Irving had immortalized. The development of mass media in the 20th century opened new possibilities for adapting and reimagining Irving's story. Radio dramatizations in the 1930s and 1940s demonstrated the tale's continued power to captivate audiences, while the medium's reliance on sound effects and music proved particularly well-suited to creating the atmospheric qualities that were so important to the story's effectiveness. The famous Orson Welles adaptation for The Mercury Theatre on the Air showed how Irving's techniques could be updated for modern audiences without sacrificing their essential character. Hollywood's discovery of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow produced a series of film adaptations that reflected changing attitudes toward both the supernatural and American history. Early film versions tended to emphasize the story's comic elements, presenting Ichabod Crane as a figure of broad humor rather than the more complex character Irving had created. Later adaptations explored darker interpretations of the tale, finding in it themes of social conflict, cultural displacement, and psychological terror that spoke to contemporary concerns about alienation and identity. The Disney animated adaptation of 1949, part of The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, introduced Irving's story to new generations of viewers while demonstrating the tale's flexibility as source material. By emphasizing the story's folk tale qualities and presenting it within a framework of American cultural celebration, Disney helped establish The Legend of Sleepy Hollow as a foundational text of American mythology, suitable for family entertainment while retaining enough genuine eeriness to satisfy audiences seeking supernatural thrills. Television adaptations in the latter half of the 20th century took advantage of the medium's capacity for atmospheric storytelling to create versions that remained closer to Irving's original vision. The most successful of these productions understood that the story's power lay not in spectacular effects, but in its ability to create a sense of place and mood that made supernatural events seem not just possible, but inevitable. The rise of Halloween as a major American cultural celebration provided a natural context for renewed interest in Irving's story. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow became associated with October traditions of ghost stories and supernatural entertainment, while the figure of the Headless Horseman joined the pantheon of classic Halloween imagery alongside jack-o'-lanterns, black cats, and haunted houses. This seasonal association helped ensure the story's continued visibility in American popular culture while connecting it to the broader tradition of autumn folklore that had always been part of its appeal. Academic study of the story revealed new layers of meaning that had been implicit in Irving's original but not fully articulated by earlier generations of readers. Scholars exploring American cultural history found in the tale a rich source of information about early 19th century attitudes toward regional identity, social mobility, and the relationship between European and American cultural traditions. Literary critics analyzing the development of American fiction recognized Irving's technical innovations and their influence on later writers, while folklorists studied the story as an example of how oral tradition could be successfully transformed into literary art. The Hudson Valley itself became a pilgrimage destination for readers seeking to experience the landscapes that had inspired Irving's imagination. Historic preservation efforts in the region often referenced the literary significance of local sites, creating a cultural tourism industry based on the continuing appeal of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The actual village of Sleepy Hollow, renamed from North Tarrytown in 1996 to capitalize on its literary associations, embraced its connection to Irving's story while working to balance commercial development with preservation of the area's historical and natural character. Modern retellings and reimaginings of the story have taken advantage of contemporary concerns and storytelling techniques to explore new aspects of Irving's original creation. Some versions have relocated the action to different time periods or geographical settings, testing the story's essential elements against new contexts. Others have focused on previously minor characters, giving voice to perspectives that Irving's original narrative did not fully explore. Still others have used the story as a starting point for entirely new tales that preserve its atmosphere and themes while creating original plots and characters. The emergence of digital media has created new opportunities for experiencing and adapting Irving's story. Online platforms have enabled the creation of interactive versions that allow readers to explore the world of Sleepy Hollow in unprecedented detail, while social media has facilitated the sharing of fan-created content that extends and elaborates upon Irving's original creation. Video games have experimented with using the story's setting and characters as the basis for interactive entertainment that preserves the tale's essential atmosphere while adding elements of player agency and choice. Contemporary writers working in the horror and fantasy genres have found in Irving's story a template for creating atmospheric supernatural fiction that relies more on suggestion than explicit description, more on psychological insight than graphic detail. The story's careful balance between humor and horror, its respectful treatment of folklore, and its integration of supernatural elements with realistic character development have influenced countless modern authors seeking to create fiction that entertains while exploring deeper themes about human nature and cultural identity. The international appeal of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow has continued to grow as American popular culture has achieved global reach. Translations and adaptations in languages and cultural contexts far removed from Irving's original setting have demonstrated the story's universal themes and enduring relevance. The figure of the Headless Horseman has become recognizable worldwide as a symbol of American folklore, while the story itself serves as an introduction to American literary traditions for international readers. Educational institutions have found in Irving's story a valuable tool for teaching both American history and literary analysis. The tale's accessibility makes it suitable for students at various levels, while its historical context provides opportunities for interdisciplinary study that connects literature to social history, folklore studies, and regional geography. The story's themes of cultural conflict and social mobility remain relevant to contemporary discussions about identity and belonging in an increasingly diverse society. As we move further into the 21st century, the legend of Sleepy Hollow shows no signs of losing its grip on the American imagination. New adaptations continue to appear with regular frequency, each finding something fresh in Irving's original, while preserving the essential elements that have made the story endure. The tale's ability to adapt to new media and new interpretive frameworks while retaining its core appeal suggests that it will continue to find new audiences and new meanings for generations to come. The Hollow itself lives on, not just as a geographical location, but as a state of mind, a space in the American imagination where the practical and the mystical, the historical and the legendary, the familiar and the mysterious continue to coexist in the delicate balance that Irving first achieved nearly 2 centuries ago. In a world increasingly dominated by technology and rational explanation, the story's preservation of mystery and wonder serves as a reminder that not all human experiences can be fully quantified or explained, that there remain spaces in both landscape and imagination where legends can still come to life and ghosts can still ride through the darkness in search of what they have lost. As the night deepens around us and the last echoes of hoofbeats fade into the distance, we find ourselves at the end of our journey through the mist-shrouded valleys of memory and imagination. The tale of Washington Irving and his immortal creation has led us through the narrow streets of old Manhattan, across the grey waters of the Atlantic, through the candlelit parlours of Dutch farmhouses, and finally to that moment when legend crystallized into literature and a local ghost story became a permanent part of the human imagination. In the gathering darkness of this autumn night, when the boundary between worlds grows thin and the ordinary landscape seems touched with possibility, we can perhaps understand something of what Irving felt as he worked by candlelight in his study at Sunnyside, transforming the whispered stories of his neighbors into prose that would outlive its creator and continue to speak to readers yet unborn. There is a kind of magic in this transformation, a mystery as profound as any supernatural phenomenon. The way that marks upon a page can capture not just the plot of a story, but its essential spirit, its capacity to make readers feel that they have walked the same moonlit roads, heard the same mysterious sounds, experienced the same delicious terror that comes from confronting the unknown. The story of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman has endured not merely because it entertains, though it certainly does that, but because it speaks to something fundamental in human nature. Our need for mystery, our hunger for stories that help us make sense of experiences that defy rational explanation, our desire to believe that the world contains more wonders than our philosophy can account for. In an age increasingly dominated by scientific materialism and technological rationality, Irving's tale serves as a gentle reminder that there are other ways of knowing, other forms of truth that cannot be measured or quantified, but nevertheless possess their own validity and importance. The landscape that inspired Irving's imagination, the drowsy hollows and mist-covered fields of the Hudson Valley, continues to cast its spell over visitors who come seeking some trace of the magic that transformed a local legend into universal literature. But the true Sleepy Hollow is not to be found in any specific geographical location, however atmospheric or historically significant. It exists in that space between the real and the imagined, between the natural and the supernatural, between what we know to be true and what we hope might be possible. This space has always existed in human consciousness, but it requires cultivation, protection, and periodic renewal if it is to remain viable. Stories like Irving's serve this essential function, keeping alive our capacity for wonder, our willingness to entertain possibilities that cannot be proven or disproven, our recognition that mystery is not the enemy of understanding, but its necessary complement. In a world that often seems all too comprehensible, all too predictable, all too thoroughly mapped and measured, the figure of the Headless Horseman serves as an ambassador from the realm of the unknown, a reminder that there are still territories of experience that remain unexplored. The genius of Irving's achievement lies not just in his creation of memorable characters or atmospheric scenes, but in his understanding of how stories function in human society, how they preserve and transmit cultural values, how they help communities make sense of their shared experience, how they provide frameworks for understanding individual identity within larger social contexts. The legend of Sleepy Hollow works as entertainment, certainly, but it also works as cultural instruction, teaching its readers about the tension between tradition and innovation, about the value of community over individual ambition, about the importance of respecting the wisdom embedded in local customs and beliefs. This instructional function was particularly important in Irving's time, when American society was still in the process of defining its own values and identity. The story provided a model for how Americans might relate to their past, not rejecting it in favor of endless innovation, but recognizing it as a source of wisdom and stability that could guide them through the challenges of social and cultural change. The Dutch settlers of Sleepy Hollow, as Irving portrayed them, had successfully created a community that preserved the best of their European heritage while adapting to American conditions, finding a balance between old and new that allowed them to prosper while maintaining their essential character. Contemporary readers may find in Irving's tale different lessons, more suited to their own time and circumstances. The story's exploration of cultural encounter and conflict speaks to our increasingly diverse society's need to find ways of honoring different traditions while creating shared institutions and values. Ichabod's fate suggests the dangers of pursuing individual advancement at the expense of community harmony, a lesson that may be particularly relevant in an age of increasing social fragmentation and economic inequality. The supernatural elements of the story continue to resonate in an era when many people hunger for experiences that transcend the purely material, seeking in various forms of spirituality and mysticism the sense of connection to larger mysteries that scientific rationalism sometimes seems to preclude. The Headless Horseman, in this context, becomes not just a figure of terror, but a symbol of the persistence of the spiritual in a materialistic age, a reminder that human beings require more than physical comfort and rational explanation to live fully satisfying lives. As we reflect on the journey we have taken through Irving's world and imagination, we might consider how his approach to storytelling offers a model for our own relationship to the stories that shape our lives and communities. Irving's respectful treatment of local folklore, his careful balance of humor and reverence, his recognition that truth comes in many forms, all of these qualities suggest ways that we might approach our own cultural heritage with the kind of thoughtful appreciation that preserves what is valuable while allowing for necessary growth and change. The candlelit world of Irving's imagination, where ghost stories were shared around winter hearths and the landscape itself seemed charged with significance, may seem remote from our digital age of instant communication and global connectivity. But perhaps this distance is itself valuable, offering us a perspective on what we may have lost in our rush toward technological sophistication and material progress. Irving's world reminds us that there are forms of wealth that cannot be measured in economic terms, kinds of knowledge that cannot be accessed through internet searches, types of community that cannot be created through social media networks. The preservation of spaces like Sleepy Hollow, both geographical and imaginative, becomes a form of cultural conservation as important as the protection of endangered species or irreplaceable historical monuments. These spaces remind us that human beings need mystery as much as they need certainty. That wonder is as essential to psychological health as rational understanding. That the capacity for enchantment is not a sign of primitive thinking, but evidence of a fully developed humanity. Irving understood this intuitively, perhaps because he wrote at a time when the balance between reason and imagination, between scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom, between individual ambition and community belonging, had not yet tipped so decisively toward one side. His story preserves this balance in literary form, creating a space where readers can experience temporarily the kind of world where both supernatural terror and natural beauty, both comic foolishness and genuine pathos, both local particularity and universal significance, can coexist without contradiction. The figure of Washington Irving himself, dreamer and diplomat, American patriot and international citizen, sophisticated artist and respectful student of folk wisdom, provides a model for the kind of cultural mediation that our own complex world requires. His ability to honor tradition while embracing innovation, to celebrate local identity while maintaining global perspective, to create art that entertains while educating, suggests possibilities for bridging the divisions that sometimes seem to threaten our social fabric. As the autumn night settles more deeply around us, and the mists rise from rivers and valleys across the landscape, we can imagine Irving working late into the night in his study at Sunnyside, surrounded by the tools of his craft and inspired by the stories that had been entrusted to his care. The candle that illuminated his pages cast a small circle of light in the encompassing darkness. But within that circle, miracles of transformation took place. Local legend became universal literature. Whispered folklore became printed permanence. The gossip of a drowsy Dutch settlement became the shared inheritance of readers around the world. That candle continues to burn in every reading of Irving's story, in every moment when a reader feels the presence of mystery in familiar surroundings, in every recognition that the world contains more wonders than any single perspective can encompass. The light it casts may seem small against the vast darkness of all we do not know, but it is sufficient to guide us through the landscape of our own experience, to help us navigate between the extremes of naive credulity and cynical skepticism, to remind us that the most important truths are often found not in what we can prove, but in what we can imagine. The Hollow lives on, not just in the Hudson Valley, but wherever readers gather to share stories that connect them to something larger than themselves, wherever communities recognize the value of preserving their own local legends and customs, wherever individuals understand that they are part of a larger story that extends backward into the past and forward into an unknown future. In this continuity of story and memory, of landscape and legend, we find perhaps the deepest meaning of Irving's achievement, the creation of a space where the human imagination can flourish, where mystery and wonder remain possible, where the past continues to speak to the present with a voice that grows more rather than less meaningful with the passage of time. and as the final candle flickers out, the whispers of Sleepy Hollow drift once more into the stillness of the night. Thank you for listening, and good night.